Hello, young people of the internet. 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 Welcome to this week's episode of Bright and Early from the Bill of Rights Institute. And it is a very special episode because today is our final episode of our first season of Bright and Early. As always, I am joined by my delightful colleagues, Gary and Kirk. Hi, gentlemen.
Hi, how are you?
So as we start off, everyone, BRI has been experimenting with this web series called Bright and Early for close to 2 months now. We launched our very first episode on March 31st, which somehow seems like yesterday and 3 millennia ago at the same time. I don't know how time works anymore. Everything's a blend. And as we like to say in our office, it's all a construct, which is a fancy word for saying made up by mankind. Not really. That's a really big conversation.
That's a whole other thing.
But we're so glad you're here, and we're so glad we've had this opportunity. So I want to start with the guys, just asking, how are you doing? Let's take a moment and really reflect on these past 2 months. What has this craziness been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like everybody, it's been uncertain, right? I mean, we're flooded with new information all the time. We're trying to figure out how we can best do our part throughout this pandemic and trying to think about the world around us. But it's really caused me to sort of reflect too on the small normal things that have been going on contrasted with the things that are really not normal. So, not being able to go out and see friends and socialize in the same way, but that I've been finding ways to connect with people, connecting with you guys every week on Bright and Early, connecting with other people from across the country, whether it's on Zoom or Skype or all the other online web conversation services I didn't even know existed before this all started. But also just in the fact that the things that we continue to see life going on is really kind of a hopeful thing too, and I think we talked about that early on, but that things don't stop even when things are extraordinarily uncertain. Time keeps moving forward. We keep having to make decisions. We keep trying to make the best of the situation that we're in. And that's really the best we can do. But there's opportunity in that too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, totally. Here at more or less, let's say, call it a 2-month mark or so that we've been together. Similar to what you're saying, I've seen an interesting thought arc or pathway that there's familiar, contrasted, and compared with ever changing. So, I mean, being in the same room, even though I pivoted a few times, is very familiar, and yet it's always been changing. And I think that's true for all the things we talk about. Long into 2 months from now, 4 months from now, 6 months from now, there'll be elements that are familiar and elements that are forever changing. And it's interesting how we mentally sort of balance both of those things. But even practically, that uncertainty 2 months ago, things are still uncertain now, but they're a different kind of uncertain. And in a strange place, in a strange way, being familiar with uncertainty is an interesting thing to wrap your head around.
Right. And that reminds me, Gary, I'm going to mess this up. So, Gary, you have to hold me through this. There's an old philosophical kind of question about a ship that's being built. Yes. And it's an old ship. And as you're replacing different pieces of the ship, when is it no longer the same ship that it was? Right? And I think there's a metaphor there for kind of our experiences over the past 2 months that, we're slowly replacing different parts of our lives with new experiences, but it's still the same. It's still our lives, and there's still common touch points, even though we're switching out aspects. Do you have any more context for that history, or we don't have to go?
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's Plato, which we all big
Plato.
fans
That's
of.
right. I wanted to make sure I didn't want to.
Yeah, it was Plato. The ship of Theseus.
Aristotle or something.
I think is what we're referring to. I often think this is going to pull. So I often think about it with baseball teams, right? So you have a team name, and you change out the players. You change out, in the case of sometimes, the city, and yet there's a weird consistency to it, right? There's this sort of ongoing existence. So yeah, the ship of Theseus is if it leaves the port and you fix the mast and you replace it, and by the time it gets to the next place, it physically is a completely different material, but is it the same ship? And I think that's exactly a good point, right? There's this continuity that exists.
That continuity, and I think that's that's an interesting metaphor for society and for kind of the challenges that we're going through is, you know, nobody who's alive today was alive during the founding. Nobody who's alive today was alive during the Civil War. Nobody, very, very few people these days who are alive today were alive during, you know, who fought in World War II. It's the 75th anniversary coming up. So those people are, very few of them are left, right? And so when is, you know, but this is still America and we're still Americans. So how does that happen? And what is the essence of what makes us who we are? This is getting kind of more philosophical than I thought we were going to go today. But I think that that's part of what these kinds of crises do, is that they make you wonder about yourself and your community and your, like, what change means and what the future is going to bring. And it kind of takes away a lot of distractions that end up focusing on what does it mean to be a teenager in 2020 or the class of 2020, right? So there was this big thing this past weekend, the convocation of 2020 with all those celebrities. That's never happened before, where we had a national graduation. What does it mean to be right now? I think it's a hard question.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly right. And looking back on our episodes, I think that was a big theme that went throughout, right? That there are things that exist and they may look different or on the surface or even upon some depth. You know, those are the questions we asked, right? So education, the concept of it, education has not ended, even though it looks very different than the way it is. And a lot of our topics, we looked at civility and we looked at concept of freedoms, and you know, each topic was a really interesting idea that these things don't vanish, but they may change enough on the surface to really reconsider. Butterflies out of larvae.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where I think it's Gandalf. And if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend checking them out. They're a great summer read or quarantine book. But Gandalf says something to the effect of, you know, you don't get to choose the time that you live. You only choose what you do with the time that you have.
Right.
And unfortunately, these kinds of things happen. They're out of our control. And yet they affect us in very profound ways. And as I look back on our episodes, you know, our conversations about how it is that we observe those changes, how it is that we reflect on them personally, and how those personal reflections can come to shape the historical legacy of what this period will be remembered as, I think is really important and informative, because future generations, when they're looking back on this, are going to go to those kinds of recordings, those personal reflections, to try and understand what it was like to live at this moment, because they won't have. And so the way that history is being formed around us, and that we're a part of it, but we're also being swept along by it, I think really underscores many of the things that you all are mentioning. But I think the central importance to trying to just keep hold of the things that we're doing in our lives and being intentional about it and continuing to learn and find out more about ourselves and about our communities.
Yeah, I hope that continues. I think you're exactly right. In a strange way, our doing a series of videos about being historians for the present is in itself a record that we have shared with each other and you as the audience, that we can look back on as almost a primary source of what our experience was at the time.
Right.
I mean, there's almost as valuable the "how are you doing" question as it was the different things we got into to talk about what it's like. And I'm excited that hopefully, if you've been watching as a student, that skill continues yourself, that if you've been following along and seeing yourself as a historian of the present, that continues long into the future, which will be
the past in the future. Yeah, and what I was struck with, that Gary, as you and Kirk were talking, was this this idea that your own reaction is the only thing ever in your control, right? Your own activity and behavior, even if you have limited physical opportunities or physical options, right? We are all still, many of us are still in various levels of quarantine, right? So when we started this episode, when we started these episodes, it was at the very beginning of the quarantine period. now that we've ended the episodes for this season, you're seeing a lot of states in different stages of reopening. So people again have very asynchronous experiences. But that we're just because we're being very philosophical right now. The Stoics and thinking about how action and reaction is the only thing that's your own action, and reaction is the only thing that's ever in your control. You can't control the world around you. You can't control what your parents are doing. You can't control what the government does, but you can control how you perceive what they are doing and how you react and what your own action is. And that's kind of was our purpose in these lessons. It was to help you understand how to react and how you were reacting, and how to think about how other people were reacting to everything that was happening.
And to pay attention, I noticed that Gary is using his cupcake mug.
Oh, no.
His cupcake cup from our observation lesson.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a really important, the action and reaction part of it. Sometimes the action is to observe. Sometimes the action is to record. Sometimes the action is to reflect on things. I mean, being an eyewitness to history is a super exciting thing if you realize you're doing it.
And knowing that you can take action that will be looked back on by yourself and future generations, right? Like making the videos or keeping the journals. You have those documents to draw on in the future when people are like, what was the pandemic of 2020 like? Because they say that about the pandemic of 1918 and the pandemic of the 60s, right? What was that like? I had a really interesting conversation with my dad recently. It had never struck me. My dad was born in 1950. It had never struck me that he was eligible for the Vietnam draft. And I had never had that because he was 18 in 1968. And I had never had the conversation until a year ago. And I am not a very young person, about what the day of the draft, the first draft day where they drew the first numbers, was like. Right? And so one day I was like, Dad, tell me about that day. I want to know what that day was like for you. And maybe it's in the future, there will be young people who are like, Gary, tell me about that day.
Right.
What was 2020 like for you?
Yeah. I mean, in fact, it's, a small interesting thing is reflecting back on what was 2 months ago like. How do you think we have developed in the past 2 months of things? I mean, for example, I didn't have a beard when we started this.
that is true. That's
Go back, look at the first episode.
And Kirk had much more of a beard when we started this episode.
Go back and look.
That's right.
Have not had a beard at any point. I'm just going to point that out. At any point in our conversations have I had a beard, but other changes have been happening for me. I think that there's one of the things we're constantly talking about is how to be historians of the present, and what the importance of that is for not only your own experience, but for the experience of those around you. Because by thinking of yourself as a historian, it reframes a lot of your conversations.
It's almost a habit of thought, right? Because you're right, it reframes the conversations, also reframes your thinking in terms of, keep going back to the idea of paying attention. But I think part of being a historian is not only being aware of observing, but also that sharing part, like you're saying, what does that mean for the conversations with other people? Even if that's for yourself through writing it down or something like that. Being aware of what's going on almost takes a different way of thinking than just living life.
Right.
I think too, it's helped, as we've been observing these things and through the conversations that we've had, really pulled into sharp focus things that we should continue to keep thinking about. How is it that we balance our own personal liberties with the needs of our communities? What is the role of state governments in county governments, especially as we're seeing this reopening? What are those different roles? How do they interact with one another? What is the most efficient way to do that? Thinking about how it is we think about the economy and what the role of the economy is and how we interact with it. on a lot of different levels. I think all those things have really been sort of sharpened and pulled into focus by this crisis, but they certainly aren't questions that are going to be going away. And in fact, maybe they can help us think about those questions. You know, what is really the core important thing that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about how it is we balance these different things in our government.
Right. I'm not sure there's been a time in, you know, recent history that people were as aware of kind of federalist issues, right? That the issues of who controls my actions, who has influence over my actions. Is it my city? Is it my county? Is it my state? Is it we have these regions now, these like associated regions of states. And then is it my federal government? And I think that this opportunity has presented the opportunity where we just weren't aware, because there was no reason to be for the vast majority of us, because most of us weren't clearly impacted by those decisions in ways that were, you know, made plain. So there'll be a lot of questions over the next decades. I mean, the ripple effects of what's happening right now are going to last a long time into your adulthood, right? So like you are 14, 15, 16, 17 right now. 10 years from now, when you're graduated from college and, you know, in the middle of your career, there are going to be decisions that are still being made based on things that are happening right now. And so that awareness and that kind of change in orientation of cultures, you know, are handshakes ever going to come back? I don't know. Are we ever going to go to movie theaters again? I don't know. There are all these things that are happening right now that will change a lot of what we have in the future.
Well, I think, you know, as we get ready for a fall where there's an election, paying attention to how these questions are being debated and discussed, I think is going to be really important. And sharing our own thoughts and our own reactions to that, and continuing to do what we've been doing, looking at what's around us, trying to find good information, being, you know, a critical consumer of that information. I think all that's going to continue to be really important and be drawn even more into focus.
No, absolutely. I think it's great to see what we're talking about as part of a continuum, right? So when we started, it was, you know, things again on the surface seemed to change, but the topics we looked at, and again, we're sort of talking about them a lot, but you know, they really had a nice kind of order to it of things that will continue. You know, these were big chunks of ideas that we had. I mean, we've mentioned a few, like the idea of federalism and voting, still going to be huge through the summer, the fall, indefinitely into the future. How technology and economics, what they look like now, what they're going to look like. Those were two that we looked at that were really interesting. Skills, civility, writing, speaking. These are those habits of thought and action that I think are ongoing. And really even the ones that seem specific to this time, the being productive in public spaces, we framed them in our episodes as during this time of crisis. But those are ongoing considerations that will continue to change and yet will be familiar. So I think now is a really interesting time to not only be historians of the present, but I feel like at some point we talked about being historians of the future. And I'm curious what we all think of what's to come in an uncertain times.
Yeah, I think the idea of the historians of the future, that, you know, everything that we chose. So, you know, Gary, Kirk, and I would meet and we'd decide on what the topics would be, and we'd prepare and we'd make choices based on what we thought was happening currently. So it was really present in people's experience, but also would help them put a framing on what their behaviors would be into the future, and what their thoughts about things would be into the future. And I think, you know, like the ship of Theseus, there are things that will stay and there will things that will change, but we'll all still be ourselves, and our communities will still be our communities, and the United States will still be the United States. Hopefully, we're still working on that. But there is, I think, our duty again as citizens. So that's something we talked about very early on. Is like, what is our duty right now? What is our responsibility? Is to continue to be diligent and vigilant and thoughtful and future oriented in a kind of optimistic way, where the choices you make have an impact right now. They always have, and they always will. It's just your capacity to make an impact is magnified. And that the exposure of all these ideas creates an opportunity for us to create the democratic habits, right? The habits, those deliberative habits, those habits of speech and reading and being up to date that will make this country that much stronger into the future.
Yeah. And everyone has a role in that. I think that's a good way to think about this here in our last episode of season 1 is the actions that we can take. Sometimes those actions are quiet actions of observation and recording. Sometimes they're taking action and remembering that if you're watching this now, you have the ability to affect those changes with thoughtfulness and with reason, and hopefully those habits are a big part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the beauty of self-government, is that we continue to have the opportunity to shape our own future, and that takes work. It takes intentionality. It takes understanding and seeking understanding. But it's a great opportunity that we all have, and one that I think we can come away from this stronger and more able to participate in.
And this is our bright and early last episode, but BRI is not going anywhere. We don't have summer break is basically what's happening, because there is so much for us to do in this new experience of technology and democracy and society. We have a lot planned. So we want to talk a little bit about kind of how you can stay involved with us, how you can engage with our resources better, and what we're looking for, and what do you want? You are the future young voters, citizens, Americans of our society, and the Bill of Rights Institute wants to be here for you into the future. So let us know. We always have Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube comments, and we're trying to figure out TikTok maybe. I got an account finally. I was like a lurker for a while, but I finally made an account so that I could save some really cool videos that I've been finding. At any rate,
future historians will have a field day with that.
There is a future happening. So Gary and Kirk, since Gary is our programs manager, he has some things to talk about student programs. So Gary, why don't you tell us kind of what's coming up?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, the timing, for those who may not know, we like to follow the school years, right? So the reason this is our last episode of this season is because we're considering the school years to be wrapping up around now. But again, we move right into our summer sessions of things. So yeah, we're gearing up for a lot of exciting student programs. And like you said, Rachel, I hope you stay in touch with us with ideas. But we have lots for students, all the way from resources of interesting things you may want to be involved in. We've got summer programs like Constitutional Academy. We'll have programs in the fall and ongoing having to do with free speech and student agency is kind of our big theme going on right now. So student voice, really hearing your thoughts, your questions, your involvement in our society is a big part of this programs. And really a big highlight starting right after this is our getting ready for our Think the Vote platform to gear up for the election year. So as you can tell,
it's going to be big and weird. That's how
I'm thinking. It's going to be big and interesting, and it's a good way to remember. Think the Vote. That's literally what it's going to be all about. Whether or not you yourself are a voting citizen in the national election, still we invite you to look at our storehouse of issues, to get involved in real interactions with other students and with brilliant experts and people involved in all different aspects of our society, not just policy and government, but also in entrepreneurship, in philanthropy, in community building, and communication. And so we've got lots of opportunities for students, and all it takes is staying in touch with us and getting involved. And what we'll have for you in return is deep explorations about big concepts and practical things that you can do in your own community.
And that's so exciting. And I think, again, all of this energy, all of this work that you've been doing to be aware of what's happening is going to have an effect on how you think about your civic duties, right? Your civic life. And big part of that is our democratic republic And the fact that we have a presidential election coming up, it's gonna be one of the more bizarre presidential elections in American history because it's taking place in the middle of a pandemic.
Right.
And it's a really contentious issues. There are really contentious issues that were surrounding that existed before, that are heightened by what's happening right now. And so people are going to need help thinking through that. And there's an opportunity for the young people of America to have a voice in thinking through that.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, exactly, it's the issues don't go away, but the surface changes and the details of it change. And again, I want to insist, even if you're not of voting age for that particular election, the beauty of why we say an election year is a big deal is you're going to see a lot of more opportunities for resources to talk about these issues. They're always there. But during an election year, particularly around fall, is when lots of different places are gearing up to share and explore these things with you. And we're going to be among them and really putting our nose to the grindstone on it.
And that's not the only, we are. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, it's just there's a lot of work to be done in advance. Between now and September,
yeah,
we're not going to be.
Oh, we're inviting you into the conversations, what I mean. Yeah.
And the other, and then Kirk, your team is busily working on content, but part of that content is directly BRI's main content focuses on teacher resources for classrooms, but there's a lot of content that's focused just on student engagement, especially our YouTube channel and the videos we're producing there and our social media channels. So why don't you talk a little bit about kind of what we're planning to do in both of those platforms?
Yeah, so we're continuing to release our Homework Help video series, which takes a look at particularly different Supreme Court cases, but now we're also starting to look at more bigger government concepts, things like federalism, like we've been discussing here on Bright and Early, and finding good ways to think about those things. And particularly for Supreme Court cases, likely things that you'll come into contact with in your government classes if you haven't already, telling the story behind those cases, and really putting you in the position where you're able to wrestle with those big central ideas as we continue to move forward here. So I think they're all going to be really exciting. We're excited to launch more of them this fall, and we'll continue to stay engaged.
Yeah, and the other thing that Kirk's team does is if you follow our social media channels, we have a lot of really cool, like this day in history or think about this idea kind of content. And his team is the one that puts all that together, making sure that you are able to stay informed with key issues. With current events news articles. So if you follow our Twitter or our Instagram, our Twitter will repost news articles that have constitutional themes. So if you're like, what is going on with, we use federalism a lot. What is going on with federalism? There'll be a hashtag that shares an article from the Washington Post or from, the Wall Street Journal or from a local newspaper where something particular happened that had to do with issues of federalism. And Kirk's team does an amazing job of making sure that our social media knows all about what's happening and tying those current events to historical context and binding those threads together. So, anything else we think these kids want to know about, guys? There's so much.
There is so much. I think there's always going to be things that we want to engage with students about. And so, my biggest thing is, to make sure it's very clear, you do not hesitate to reach out for us with anything, whether it's a question, an idea, sorting through anything. These are big concepts and we all enjoy tackling them together. We don't have answers to partake from, but rather we just love the pursuit of it and living through history day to day.
Yes, that's right. I was just gonna say that's right, and we appreciate all of you joining with us on that journey as we think about these things. We don't have all the answers, but we're certainly people who are curious about finding more out about them. So we appreciate your helping us along that journey, and we hope you've enjoyed spending some time with us.
We do always have more questions, though, because that is how we exist in this world. And on that note, we just want to say thank you. It's been a crazy couple of months. It's been a really beneficial and beautiful experience. I'm going to speak for myself. So I was in the classroom for almost 10 years. I don't have students right now. But one of the impetuses for us coming together on this is giving students somewhere to go to think about the big issues and for us to be able to be excited about talking about them for young people. So I want to thank you for that opportunity. I have really enjoyed getting the opportunity to think through these issues and how I would present them to young people, and what excites me about what's happening right now, and what excites me about the future for you and for our society. And so I think that Americans are incredibly resilient and incredibly capable in solutions and problem solving. I talked about that in one of our very first episodes when it came to de Tocqueville, and what he saw as America's greatness was its ability to come together in times of need. And so over the past 2 months, we've seen that in spades. And that brings me a sense of joy and hope for the future, and hopefully that you're seeing that in your communities.
Yeah, no, I just similarly, I think the overwhelming feeling I have for now is one of gratitude, and thanks to you for spending some time with us, to choosing to use some of the time that you're at home now, or if you're looking back on the future, whatever it is you're doing, to just spend a little time with us. And I hope it's been clear that, part of our impetus was just to say that we are here and we are listening and we are sharing, and you can count on us to be around no matter what things look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And please do stay in touch. We're here to continue to support you. So let us know how we can best do that. And we are happy to do all that we can.
So young people of the internet, on behalf of Bright and Early's season 1, thank you so much. Be well, stay bright, and we'll see you in the future. Bye.
Bye.